Hello and welcome to Perfecting the Prequels, The Clone Wars. This is following on from a previous stream, Perfecting the Prequels, The Phantom Menace, which is inspired by a redraft of the prequel trilogy done by myself and Nathan Hood, and you can find that video over on Nathan's channel. I've gone over the purpose and the rules for these redrafts and these rewrites on the previous film, so I won't rehash them here. So let's get straight into the plot summary from that original stream on fixing the prequels between myself and Nathan. The Clone Wars redraft begins with a light-hearted Indiana Jones-esque adventure with Obi-Wan and Anakin. Now, we decided on this because it works for the purposes of character development, to actually see the two working together as a healthy fraternal partnership, rather than simply having Anakin whining that he's jealous of my power, only seeing the worst aspects of their relationship as to create friction, which culminates in their final fight. If we're going to look at Alec Guinness's portrayal of Obi-Wan in the original Star Wars, I think you really need to invest so much in terms of being able to build up that friendship between them. The previous redraft focused on that regarding getting rid of Jake Lloyd and increasing Anakin's age and making Obi-Wan more of a brother figure as opposed to Qui-Gon as a father figure. There's also the aspect that this development can be shown on screen as opposed to what we see in the film or don't see in the film, which is to see character development used through throwaway lines like falling into the nest of Gundarks, and it's not an original comment. It's something also that Red Letter Media brings up, but nevertheless, it's very much a missed opportunity in the films, and I do believe the runtime could have afforded this. But the reason the Clone Wars starts off is that it serves as a contrast to the very serious opening of the Phantom Menace at the funeral of Queen Amidala's father, but also the conspiracy between the Nemoidians and Dark Plagueis. Nevertheless, having this light-hearted opening also serves as a dramatic juxtaposition to the events the two Jedi are witness to after. This event is the wholesale attack on Coruscant, as opposed to the localized assassination attempt on Senator Amidala. Indeed, Amidala remains queen in the redraft. This sparks a Republic-wide crisis and buttresses support for Palpatine's attempts at creating a grand army for the Republic. It is left ambiguous in the draft as to who is behind this attack. Nathan was considering that this would be Darth Maul and Jango Fett, or just Maul. As if you're continuing the spirit of my Perfecting the Prequel stream, my rewrite doesn't have him as a Sith. He's simply Maul, an unaffiliated Force user. But nevertheless, that wasn't clear, and I'm hoping to clear that up with my additions to this draft. It also wasn't clear from the end of my Phantom Menace rewrite what happened to Maul. Well, here, Maul had retreated with the Nemoidians after their defeat on Naboo. As the first film was an ode to the invasion of Manchuria, the historical reference we were extrapolating for this is to begin with Pearl Harbor, the attack on Coruscant, and to end with the Doolittle raid. How exactly these historical events will transpire in the narrative will be clearer hopefully at the end. Amidala has been spending much time on Coruscant as queen, not as senator, as part of the negotiations with the would-be separatists, but her experience with the invasion on Naboo has left her skeptical of the Republic, yet anxious to retain Naboo's independence against the separatist threat. Indeed, a major gulf is brewing between Naboo's Queen Amidala and the Chancellor and Senator from Naboo, Palpatine. Palpatine remains both Senator and Supreme Chancellor in this. Palpatine favors centralizing power in the Republic, and Queen Amidala is anxious not to have the people of Naboo conscripted into a Republic army. This would essentially be replacing a Nemoidian occupation with a Republican occupation. All of this is to provide context which is missing in the original film. Why exactly is the original Padme against the creation of an army? Because you would have thought, based on what has been provided to in terms of her only backstory, which is her as queen in the original Phantom Menace, that she would be the most pro creation of the army, especially as she was the one who led the motion of no confidence against Valorum, for the Republic having not done enough to help the situation in Naboo. So it is entirely paradoxical in the film, and I believe it's to set her up as the genesis of the later rebellion and the New Republic. But here it is very clear as to what our motivations are, which is to retain Naboo's independence from her own chancellor and from Nemoidian reprisals following the failed invasion. Now, in the redraft, Padme Amidala's solution to this conundrum is to appeal to Anakin. Anakin, who, after the attack, she is meeting for the first time since he helped rescue her on Naboo in the Phantom Menace. A personal connection has thus already been established, and Anakin is anxious to escape the rigidity of the Jedi lifestyle, notwithstanding his positive relationship with Obi-Wan. As Anakin went off with Obi-Wan in the Phantom Menace to rescue Padme, Anakin's consistent through line is emancipation, something that Padme could potentially offer him. Padme is attracted to him and is lacking a strong male figure in her life since the death of her father. Padme is the one to ultimately seduce Anakin away from celibacy, rather than vice versa in the films, a bizarre character choice in the original Clone Wars, which basically makes Anakin out to be some sort of sex-repressed creep, and apparently in the Star Wars universe, according to Natalie Portman, political figures can't have children. I recall the shock and horror in was it The Rise of Skywalker about the idea of Palpatine having children. So that is rebuffed now canonically if you're going to take me seriously on that. But anyway, throwing all of that out, Padme is the instigator. But the romance is a secondary consideration for Padme's primary political aim, which is to have a strong Jedi assume the mantle of a constable of Naboo, and my sort of terminology is like a la the constable of France, like a leading general or military advisor to the monarch. And this would be to reduce the dependency on the Republic and act as a deterrent to the Nemoidians should they return. You know, we have a powerful Jedi in our midst, and potentially they could call in for reinforcements. The romance between Anakin and Padme too is in part politically calculated to draw him away from the Jedi Council, committing Anakin to the defense of Naboo first and the Republic second. An emotional and practical core of their relationship is thus established, something which is absent, I think we can all agree, in the incredibly stale and unbelievable romance in the original Clone Wars. And again, this leads into my main point in terms of criticism of George Lucas, which is his major failing seems to be with character development. During their time together, Anakin and Padme, they can reminisce on their childhood experiences, Anakin's own experiences of slavery, and Padme's relation with her father, and indeed her own conception of what it means to be a ruler of Naboo. This is the first time, indeed, they can discuss their views on Palpatine. Padme can recall her opposition to him, both as senator and as chancellor, and that he was her father's advisor, and indeed he was essentially her inheritance as an advisor, not someone she put there. And she also will never forget the fact, building on from my Perfecting the Prequels stream now, that he was simultaneously completely dedicated to the Republic and then led the charge against Valorum. She doesn't exactly trust Palpatine because she is rather savvy and has keen political instincts which would serve her well. But of course, Anakin has the opposite view. This aspect wasn't in the original draft, but Anakin could contrast this with Palpatine's visit to Tatooine. and his role as an advocate to Qui-Gon along with Obi-Wan in freeing him originally. So here I'm just adding a bit of context to the original redraft, which is following on from the Perfecting the Prequels, the Phantom Menace stream. That, and of course, Anakin is completely behind Palpatine's crusade against corruption, but in a far more nuanced way, rather than simply saying everyone must be made to agree, essentially, which is his shtick, his rather clumsy shtick in the Clone Wars. To fully commit Anakin to her, Padme allows Anakin to rescue his mother, something the Jedi had forbidden as contributing to his fear of loss and temptation to the dark side. On Tatooine, Anakin confronts his old Hutt master, not Watto, where it is discovered that Shmi was worked to death. You can almost say as a form of reprisal or even punishment for having Anakin escape in the first place. So Anakin is feeling immense guilt for having been in many ways responsible for his mother's death. He feels frustrated at the Jedi for having allowed this situation, for having prevented him from going back. But also Anakin is so incensed at the Hutts that he attempts to murder his Hutt master and indeed launch an attack on all of the Hutts of Tatooine. If anything, this should prove that the Jedi were right in a sense to try and keep him away from Tatooine and from reconnecting to his mother, because the fear here has led to anger, that has led to rage. I know it sounds incredibly sort of pastiche me saying that, but Yoda here was actually correct. However, in the redraft, Padme intercedes and stops Anakin from doing so. At once, Padme has saved Anakin from falling to the dark side. Yet Anakin has broken his Jedi training and fallen completely in love with Padme, and this is another type of fall from grace. Back on Coruscant, Obi-Wan has been investigating the attack, but he has no leads. He decides on a different course to the other Jedi to find out what happened to Dooku after the events of the Phantom Menace. Few Jedi care that Dooku has left, with most assuming that he became an anchorite to become one with the Force. For people who don't know what an anchorite is, essentially a monk. Through Obi-Wan's investigations, he encounters figures like Jocasta Nu, and this was the original librarian of the Jedi Temple, and Plo Koon, who is another prominent Jedi on the Council. And this was also spurred on by Obi-Wan's personal curiosity, as Dooku is his last link to Qui-Gon, as Qui-Gon's old Jedi Master. And indeed, looking back to Dooku's own character development, there is that personal sense of loss for Qui-Gon having been killed by Pelagus, and for Dooku not having been there. Obi-Wan's investigation takes him to Dooku's last location, on Kamino. Here it is discovered that the Separatists have been building a clone army to compensate for the deficiencies of the Nemoidian drone army at the Battle of Naboo. Again, the major plot twist and change of Nathan and my draft from the original film is that the clone army has been built for the Separatists and not for the Republic, and thus we can remove that incredibly contrived and self-defeating sequence of events. Someone, I think, just to point it out there on that stream, someone actually mentioned that they love the clones and think the clones should be integrated for their aesthetic. And I just have to say to that sort of perspective here that there is no reason whatsoever that a human militia can have the exact sort of forerunner aesthetics of the stormtroopers, and the clones can have an entirely different aesthetic. So that argument doesn't hold any weight as far as I'm concerned. You may take all of the ships, all of the aesthetics from the clones, and basically recontextualize that as having been the uniforms of the actual soldiers and not the uniforms of the clones. But anyway, moving on. Obi-Wan is captured and is sent to Dooku on Geonosis, but not before he sends a message back to Coruscant to warn of the creation of a clone army. This piece of evidence is sufficient for Palpatine to convince the Senate to create the Grand Army of the Republic and afford Palpatine new emergency powers. Again, the very sort of simple idea of creating an army to face another army as opposed to creating an army prematurely, before you decide to create an army, which was the logic of the original Clone Wars. On Geonosis, Dooku reveals that he has left the Jedi to reform the Republic after the death of Qui-Gon, for which he feels responsible. Dooku has been augmenting his powers through contact with a Phantom Force user, which is in fact an aspect of Palpatine, a fact that Dooku is not aware of. Relying on his personal connection to Obi-Wan through Qui-Gon, Dooku attempts to convince Obi-Wan over to the Separatist cause. Obi-Wan sympathizes with Dooku, but is aware that Dooku is under the influence of the dark side, something that he intimates Dooku himself might not be aware of. Dooku then resorts to more drastic measures. The Neimoidians want Dooku to capture Padme to coerce Naboo to join the Separatists after their original invasion in The Phantom Menace failed. Further, Dooku spies an opportunity to capture Anakin alongside Padme to blackmail Obi-Wan into joining him. Dooku then leads a dramatic raid on the Palace of Naboo, capturing both the Queen and Anakin. On Geonosis, Obi-Wan is repulsed by the attempted blackmail, morally repulsed, I should say, and Anakin follows Obi-Wan's lead in rejecting Dooku, and once again, as we saw at the beginning of the redraft of The Phantom Menace, Amidala will not surrender the sovereignty of her people under any circumstances, even if that mean her own imprisonment or even death. Left with no choice, Dooku offers the three as trophies to the Separatists, as was played out in the arena scene in the original Clone Wars. Here, a preliminary detachment of the New Republic army attacks Geonosis in a daring raid, reminiscent of the Doolittle Raiders. Again, you have Pearl Harbor, the massive attack on the American naval installations in Hawaii by the Imperial Japanese Navy, and then the Americans, to represent that they can actually attack Japan, launch what ultimately transpires to be a premature but nevertheless significant propaganda victory, which is the first aerial attack on Japan. So this would essentially be the equivalent, looking into George Lucas's penchant for World War II analogies in terms of trying to envisage these scenarios again. As with my attempt last time to rehabilitate Jar Jar Binks, I'm very much trying to stick to Lucas's original vision. Because this is only a preliminary detachment, the Republic troops here are novices. However, it is presented that they arrived with Yoda, and Yoda is leading them. It is revealed that the Jedi were strong-armed, essentially, into providing tactical leadership as officers in the new army, lest the troops be massacred by the clones. And you can say that in many ways, Palpatine was blackmailing the Jedi. I'm creating a new army of hastily trained conscripts. The Republic has no military tradition. So if they were to be sent off without you, and if you were to stick by your sort of more conservative scruples of inaction and not going off in, lust for warfare, then all of these people will die, and you will be indirectly responsible. This, of course, is still incredibly controversial, yet it is Yoda's presence that is the major breach of precedent, and a signal that the Jedi will work alongside the Chancellor in defending the Republic. It was also mentioned on that stream that how Yoda and the Jedi interact with the army, and by extension with the new clone army, isn't simply a massive, outrageous lightsaber duel, as we saw, because it should be clear that the Jedi cannot be easily replaced. There are very few Jedi, and it takes a lifetime to train a Jedi. So the loss of a Jedi is a significant thing. So all the more reason to have the Jedi actually be in reserve and only fight in one-to-one combat as a last resort, not to have them running headfirst and flinging lightsabers everywhere as we saw in the original Clone Wars. The emphasis here is that they are officers. They are not warriors. Well, they are warriors, obviously, but the emphasis on leadership and not combat prowess. And in this sense, Yoda doesn't actually go off to fight Dooku in a lightsaber duel, but he is there essentially buttressing the morale of his men, and you can say using other sort of force powers like battle meditation or what have you, other sort of ways to demonstrate mastery of the source of the Force rather than lifting rocks and using a lightsaber. This isn't an original point. A lot of people criticize Yoda and the fight for being far too silly. I'm not necessarily of the extreme view that many people have on that, which is that it ruins his character. But nevertheless, you can use Yoda in a far more reserved and you can say consistent capacity as a leader rather than a Jedi warrior. The film's epilogue shows Yoda consenting to the marriage of Anakin and Padme, and this is a sign that the Jedi can reform and that Yoda now wants or rather represents, a progressive faction within the Jedi, a new progressive faction, pushing back against the forced celibacy of the Jedi. Forced in the sense that none of the Jedi want to be celibate, rather they are found as children and they remain celibate so as to essentially suppress any sort of sense of self. And you can say that this is actually one of the most sadistic elements of the Jedi, that they're essentially it's a form of forced servitude, which is why the emancipation arc of Anakin is so important in terms of being able to understand his transition into being Darth Vader. However, while this may be seen to be a positive step, you can say compassionate step, that Yoda is consenting to the marriage of a Jedi, Anakin, with Padme. Indeed, this is also a very politically savvy step, because Padme is suspicious of the Jedi Council, she's suspicious of the Republic, but in many ways you can say Yoda is bringing on Padme as an ally by consenting to this relationship. However, Yoda has inadvertently taken many steps to fracture the Jedi Order. He's exacerbated the schism with the conservatives under Ki-Adi-Mundi, who wish to retain celibacy, and question the new role of the Jedi in the Republic Army. Anakin is more dependent on Padme now than ever. Indeed, Padme was as much the cause of their rescue and Palpatine was as much the cause of their rescue as the Jedi. So this is effectively pushing him further away from those on the council who were so concerned about the consequences of action. So the schism has deepened, and Anakin is far more suspicious over anyone who is going against Palpatine's desire to create the Republic Army and clean up corruption. You can almost say that Anakin is beginning to see these Jedi as synonymous with the endemic corruption within the Republic. Ultimately, all of Yoda's actions have turned him into the unwitting pawn of Palpatine at the onset of the Clone Wars, albeit I hope that Nathan and my draft here has afforded Yoda a lot more agency, and you can almost say far more culpability than he was afforded in the original films, which essentially made him an idiot. And you can say far more passive, and his actions were far more inexplicable when he finally laments the beginning of the war. Now here, coming to my revised points, embellishing or perhaps pushing back against some of the elements in the redraft. The first thing I wanted to bring up is actually the fun adventure at the beginning, because my idea is that the adventure would actually take place on Kashyyyk, the Wookiee planet, partly because this would actually set up something which we mentioned in terms of our redraft for episode 3, which is keeping the Battle of Kashyyyk from Revenge of the Sith, and in that sense actually having a seemingly unrelated scene, adventure scene take place on Kashyyyk would actually set up the Wookiees, set up the dynamic on that planet, and then again you have that contrast in Revenge of the Sith when you see the planet being invaded by a massive sort of multi-planet spanning army in the clones. And again, you can see this place in a better condition as opposed to a war zone that we later see. In terms of what exactly they're doing on Kashyyyk, you can have, say, for example, a shadowy organization. If I'm going to look at, KOTOR, you can say Circa Corporation or something. It could be anything. I don't want to be too sort of reliant on KOTOR when it comes to conceiving of a Wookiee plot here. But some shadowy organization has infiltrated the planet and compelled Wookiees into indentured servitude. And the role of Anakin and Obi-Wan here as representing Jedi ambassadors to the Wookiee leadership on Kashyyyk is to rescue them. And perhaps again, as a little nod to the films, you can have them fall into a nest of Gondarks en route. Um, I looked into it. Apparently, Gondarks are desert-dwelling creatures, but I think they were only mentioned once in Empire Strikes Back. So essentially, if we're doing a complete do-over of the lore and Attack of the Clones, there is no reason why they can't be dwelling essentially on a forest planet, which is what Kashyyyk is. When coming to the attack on Coruscant, I want to add a lot of needed context exactly for what's going on here, which is that Palpatine begins the film lamenting the failure of his negotiations and the impending end of his term as Chancellor. Newt Gunray has been ransomed back to the Neimoidians at the end of The Phantom Menace in return for their withdrawal from Naboo, while the Jedi remained on Naboo as a temporary deterrent to the Neimoidians lest they come back. Very shortly afterwards, Newt Gunray was deposed as sovereign of Neimoidia, and Maul, not Darth Maul, but simply Maul because he's not a Sith, disappears. Palpatine's negotiations are alluded to in the original film, but outlined here, they are centered on reintegrating Neimoidia and other restive, soon-to-be separatist systems back into the Republic, and to commit to a series of Republic-wide reforms aimed at eradicating corruption. However, Palpatine has sent threats and massively aggravated the wavering systems to the point that they retaliate with an attack on Coruscant itself in the hope of discrediting or killing Palpatine and his allies. For Palpatine, this diplomatic provocation was intentional to justify the Military Creation Act against the Separatists after they would launch essentially such an attack on Coruscant. Thus, all of a sudden, Palpatine's political reputation hasn't diminished as a result of this, but he's actually been able to increase it. Now the Republic is under assault. Now these systems have entered into rebellion against the main sort of Republic government. So all of Palpatine's actions can be considered consistent with this idea of him accumulating power and using war and the threat of war as a means essentially of consolidating a new army and a new centralized state under him, Chancellor, soon to be Emperor Palpatine. As for the nature of the attack itself, the attack was effectively a suicide mission. Of course, in the original draft, it was led by important personages such as Jango Fett and Maul, but there aren't any significant personages on this. But however, there is a investigation onto the ship. Again, it's not a Neimoidian ship. They haven't seen the ship before. And they find these strange armor-clad creatures on board this attack ship. And it later turns out that these are duplicates of Maul, someone that everyone had assumed had gone, but also there are multiple Mauls. There isn't simply the one Maul. So the Jedi don't even know if the original Maul was part of the attack on Coruscant. In the aftermath of this attack, the Jedi recall their garrison squad from Naboo to defend the temple on Coruscant, and this plays directly into Palpatine's hands as accelerating the need for a Republic-wide military. Now the Jedi aren't committing themselves to defend the outer planets, but focusing all of their attention rather myopically and self-centeredly on the defense of the Jedi Temple. It is here Padme comes to blows against the Jedi for their retreat, and indeed she comes to blows against Palpatine for needlessly provoking the situation. She recognizes that Palpatine's way of negotiating or not negotiating may lead to the exact scenario that happened with the attack on Coruscant. Now, the prospect arises of Padme possibly disowning Palpatine as Naboo's Chancellor, and this would potentially end his career, his chancellorship, his rise to power, because his original rise to power was predicated on the Naboo sympathy vote. But how is that essentially going to sustain itself if Naboo disowns the Chancellor? Which is why it is so important to have Padme retain her position as Queen, because she now unlike in the film, she represents a far greater position of power and thus a far greater threat to Palpatine, and thus something that Palpatine always has to consider in all of his calculations, as opposed to Padme in the films, who just sort of lingers on in the background and ends up marrying Anakin and suggesting things with other senators, but never really getting anywhere. Albeit, I do believe that Lucas conceived of her character as the genesis of the later rebellion. Out of this, with the Jedi garrison having been withdrawn and having not wanted to support the creation of a Republic-wide army, Padme suggests a compromise whereby a Jedi be stationed permanently, one Jedi be stationed permanently on Naboo, and she suggests Anakin, to which Palpatine leaps at the opportunity, because this will temporarily assuage their rift and separate Anakin from the rest of the Jedi Council. This marks the beginning of Palpatine's project to ensnare Anakin as his potential apprentice. Bear in mind that, unlike what we saw in the films, Palpatine actually does not have any Sith apprentices up until Anakin commits himself in Revenge of the Sith. Maul is not his apprentice, and Dooku will not become his apprentice. So therefore, you can say that the project for Palpatine and Anakin is not exactly predicated on him having to murder all of his other, or contrive the deaths of all of his other apprentices to end up in this situation. There's just the one apprentice throughout this, or would-be apprentice, which is Anakin, later Darth Vader. And not to rehash everything, but to go back to the original redraft summary, the relationship between Padme and Anakin then proceeds as with the original. I do believe that we did a lot in terms of being able to hash out and create an emotional core for that relationship, and I don't feel that I can really add anything to it. So most of my revisions regarding the Clone Wars actually focus on the character of Dooku, and indeed the implications of Maul, because Maul was thrown around quite a lot as a background character, almost like some sort of Indiana Jones-esque muscle man, someone with no sort of project or ambition of his own. He was just an antagonist, kind of like a boss you would just occasionally come up with and have to come into contact with and have to confront. But the perfecting the prequels, the Phantom Menace, focused on Maul as a bodyguard who was linked to Darth Plagueis, had been versed essentially in his form of teaching of the dark side, and he had been a general leading the flagship. And ultimately, he had been humiliated when Newt Gunray was captured by the Naboo and the Gungan militias at the Battle of Naboo. However, the discovery, so going back to the plot, the discovery of the Maul duplicates has everyone baffled, as Maul had supposedly fled after Gunray was deposed. Thus, it isn't clear that the Nemoidians were the perpetrators of the attack. Indeed, in the Clone Wars, I think it's rather obvious that the Nemoidians were the perpetrators of the attack, but for some bizarre reason, Padme says, oh, Dooku was behind it all. And this is, from an audience point of view in the film, having no idea who Dooku is because he hasn't been introduced to us yet. And as with the original draft, just to emphasize, Dooku is in no way implicated in the arrangement of this plot, and Padme has no reason to suspect him or have any animosity towards him whatsoever, thus feeding into the dramatic twist in the story which is going to come about later. Because it is not clear that the Nemoidians were the perpetrators of the attack, and no one knows what the Maul duplicates are or what they represent, it is surmised by the Jedi that perhaps Maul was acting alone and out of revenge for his humiliation in the invasion of the Naboo. And after this, the trail goes cold for most of the Jedi investigating this. In the original redraft, Obi-Wan had sought out Dooku's last whereabouts, but his motivations I don't think we made clear enough. Here, in terms of being able to expand upon that idea, the ideas brought up here, the reason the Jedi were so dismissive about Dooku, basically saying, oh, he's gone off, he can never become a Sith, oh, he hasn't done anything, oh, he's just become a monk or an anchorite. The reason the Jedi are so dismissive about Dooku and ambivalent towards his fate was because he had been the principal opposition to the other members of the now former Jedi triumvirate, Yoda and Ki-Adi-Mundi. So Ki-Adi-Mundi's allies in particular are gleeful that Dooku is no longer a consideration. Good riddance to Dooku, essentially. However, Obi-Wan has no leads, and he wants someone to advise him that perhaps isn't so close to the action in Coruscant, someone who could provide him a different perspective, an independent perspective, now that Dooku has basically gone rogue. And indeed, Dooku represents that last conduit to Qui-Gon. In a sense, Dooku is the last member of Obi-Wan's Jedi family. Thus, when Dooku is sought out, it is explicitly as an ally to Obi-Wan. And as with the original redraft, Dooku's story is being retold through his former friends in the temple, Plo Koon and Jocasta Nu, the only people who seem invested in what happened to Dooku. Because bear in mind that so many of the interventionist Jedi, the leading interventionist Jedi, with the possible exception of Mace Windu, who survives, who is perhaps the only devotee of Dooku who remains in the temple, all the others are pretty much dead. Qui-Gon is dead. The other Jedi that went with Qui-Gon to defeat Pelagius are dead. Jocasta Nu and Plo Koon are incredibly old. They're basically retired members of the council, and Jocasta is a librarian. So the vast majority of the Jedi who are aligned to the prevailing factions do not care about Dooku and basically see the implosion of the interventionist faction with his departure. Through his pursuit of Dooku, Obi-Wan discovers on Kamino that the Maul duplicates were in fact the prototypes of a new clone army. Of course, Kamino being the last known location of Dooku, which has been provided to him, let's say by Jocasta Nu. You don't need the whole Dexter Jester character and that subplot and the whole contrived nonsense of Jango Fett organizing the assassination, then the Dart, which is related to a planet which isn't in the archive memory, all of that. Get rid of all of that. Just focus on the last known location of Dooku, Kamino, where Obi-Wan discovers that that is in fact the ground zero for the creation of the Maul duplicates, the new clone army. It was actually something I've been toying with quite a lot in terms of making the clones menacing. And indeed, Maul is iconic simply for his look, because he has virtually no character development in The Phantom Menace. But it's not just, I think, having Maul duplicates. I also believe having them armor-clad as well. Not necessarily using force powers or lightsabers, but you can say spears and other sort of melee weapons and things like that. And of course, having the reflexes and the physical strength of the original Maul, though without the ability to use the Force. I think it offers a range of different sort of ways that the film and indeed all the battle scenes can play out, as opposed to having the Jango Fett clones. And indeed, if you're to add a bit of variety and include armor sets, that would be consistent with law regarding sort of traditional sort of Sith armor and Sith plating. So I don't know, maybe that'll be a controversial decision to have Maul be the template for the clones, not Jango Fett. But I'll go into it actually in more depth and actually explain that this has major implications for the whole separatist movement. It was entirely logical for the Nemoidians to choose Maul as their template because he had been the bodyguard to New Gunray, and he was indeed so powerful that he was their sole exception to the use of battle droids. You can say that after the Nemoidians get rid of New Gunray, Maul has essentially become, you can almost say he becomes like a bounty hunter or something. But then the Nemoidians are basically going around with the prospect of finding a way of updating their armies now they've been humiliated. And they think, okay, there are these people on Kamino we can enlist the help of. Why don't we establish a clone army? But here's the question. Who would be a suitable template for a clone army? And obviously the answer of the new Nemoidian leadership is Maul. And so Maul provides that template to supersede the droid armies, albeit I'm sure that in all the battles and films you will see the use of droids, but not in the totalizing way that we see in The Phantom Menace. But because of this, Maul has returned to preeminence. Indeed, Maul hasn't returned as a general solely of the Nemoidians, but he is now a generalissimo, coordinating the efforts of the entire separatist movement. And in terms of the sort of consistency of this character is Grievous in The Revenge of the Sith. So this completely supplants the role of Grievous, and it establishes it much earlier in the events of the Clone Wars. And indeed, I think Maul is a far more compelling and indeed consistent antagonist, secondary antagonist throughout this redraft of the 3 films, rather than Grievous, who appears out of nowhere, and I don't believe is subjective, but I don't believe is a really intimidating character to begin with. And indeed, add this aspect to it, having Maul being the clone template. Maul is the father of the clones, and thereby you can say his power is amplified. The separatists fear that Maul may be using their cause and the use of the clone army as a springboard for a personal dictatorship. Some plot element which is almost completely absent regarding as to what Jango Fett's own motivation is in providing himself as the clone template in the Clone Wars. Were here, Maul has a secret agenda. Yes, it's a way of him being able to buy back into the Nemoidians' good graces, but now all of the clones are essentially his children. And so I think Maul can understand that there may come a time where he may use the Maul clones against his separatist allies and take full control for himself. So unwittingly, the separatists have basically created a Trojan horse at the center of their entire sort of political system. Now, finally, enter Dooku. Dooku had sought out the Nemoidians for the sake of personal revenge after their collaboration with Pelagius. But then Dooku does not encounter just the Nemoidians, but the Nemoidians in alliance with the other separatist systems. He is able to put aside his personal animosity. Remember, he's a Jedi, he's not given over to the dark side yet. He's able to put aside his personal animosity regarding Qui-Gon's death because Dooku sees in the Separatists the possibility of impressing his beliefs, which are now distinct from the rest of the Jedi Council, his interventionist beliefs, on a political alternative to the Republic, circumventing and perhaps surpassing the Jedi and the Chancellor Palpatine. It is Dooku's ambition, and this isn't obviously helped by his initial revenge plot, that marks the beginning of his fall to the dark side. However, Dooku has to confront Maul, who is trained in the Force through his original connection to Pelagius. Dooku concludes that Maul must go, something that many separatists would welcome now that he is no longer needed as the template for the clones. In order to defeat Maul, Dooku is seduced by a shadowy aspect who entices him with the prospect of greater mastery of the Force beyond all the Jedi. Remember that Maul has that link to Pelagius, and because Dooku is still effectively just a Jedi, he is completely ignorant of everything that Pelagius could have taught him, unlike Maul. This is an aspect of Palpatine, which of course has many implications going forward, the third film, but it should be emphasized here that unlike what we see in the films with Sidious and Dooku being aware essentially what the other's position is, you can say Dooku is nothing but the fool guy in the films for Palpatine, and then he doesn't say anything when he's about to get his head chopped off by Anakin. It is crucial in terms of understanding Dooku's through line here that albeit he courts an aspect of Palpatine, he has no idea what this aspect represents. It is simply a path to power. He is unaware that it has anything to do with Palpatine or that he is being duped. In terms of Palpatine's own motivations for working with Dooku specifically, Palpatine rightly fears working with Maul because Maul is already versed in the dark side. And also there's the possibility that it may be revealed that Palpatine was Pelagius's original Sith apprentice who betrayed his master. And again, that would obviously mean that Maul is incredibly suspicious of anything Palpatine would essentially have to offer him, far more so than someone who is far more, you can say, naive and confused as Dooku. Essentially, Dooku here is the tragic figure, which is actually probably why I chose this thumbnail, as opposed to the incredibly static and undeveloped character, despite the fact he was played by Christopher Lee, which is probably why the character has any sort of enduring impact is through the actor and not through the character. It is through Dooku, now duped, that Palpatine learns the plans of the Separatists and all about the creation of the clone army. And this is an important fact when it comes to Obi-Wan's brief act of heroism and getting that information back. Because of the connection between Palpatine and Dooku, Palpatine is already aware of Maul, he is already aware of the Maul duplicates, the clone army, and so what Obi-Wan essentially does in sending the information back is provide credibility and a provenance to that information which Palpatine himself could not give. But nevertheless, Palpatine is aware of it, he is prepped for it, and he does everything to ensure that message comes in and is relayed as loudly and pervasively throughout the entire Republic. So he lays the groundwork for that convenient bit of evidence information coming in to spur on the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic. So going back to the original plot conception, of course, Obi-Wan is captured and sent to Geonosis. When Obi-Wan refuses Dooku's offer to join him, Dooku, instead of what we see when he goes out of his way to attack Naboo, here in this revision, Dooku actually turns to Palpatine for advice. And it is Palpatine who offers to abduct Anakin and Padme. And this is in order to, obviously, as with the previous draft, to blackmail Obi-Wan, and indeed, the new consideration here, to trump Maul by delivering the Neimoidians the ruler of Naboo. So there is an internal power dynamic between Dooku and Maul over who could be more useful to the Separatists. And indeed, if it is Dooku who is seen to be the one to essentially give Amidala over to the Neimoidians, then his power relation vis-a-vis Maul changes considerably. If we're to represent a power struggle within the leadership of the separatist movement, then there is, of course, the consideration that with this new authority, this new power, and with Obi-Wan having joined the side of Dooku, then perhaps finally Dooku can defeat Maul in battle and become the undisputed leader of all the Separatists. So it is Palpatine who launches the raid on Naboo Palace, and this is something he carries off flawlessly because he knows the exact location of the Queen, being its senator, and the layout of all the defenses and bypasses them. This is an aspect of Palpatine which is fully immersed in the dark side. Palpatine easily stuns Anakin while not having to reveal any identity other than his immersion in the dark side. And I think from a aesthetic and an audience point of view, we shouldn't actually have any close-ups or images of this Palpatine, because in terms of how this story is being relayed to the audience does not know, as with Dooku, that the shadowy aspect is Palpatine. It is not as blunt as we see in the film with Sidious appearing in his hood. No, it is simply a dark side aspect. The audience may suspect that the dark side aspect might have something to do with Palpatine, but in terms of how it comes across, in terms of its voice, Dooku has no reason to suspect that this is in fact the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. So when Palpatine attacks the Naboo Palace, it can be shot in a way that basically he appears like a wraith. He does not appear like Palpatine will appear in his physical representation with Revenge of the Sith, which bleeds in to his portrayal in Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi, just in terms of adding a bit of visual variety as opposed to simply having him in the bloody hood the entire time. And of course, having this ambiguous physical form is essential in terms of ensuring that Anakin, as with his ability, Palpatine's ability to selectively repress the Force, thereby throwing Anakin off, that Anakin cannot suspect that this dark side spectre is in fact Palpatine. But of course, Palpatine knows exactly where Anakin is. He knows where Padme is, so he can dispatch them quite easily without Anakin even having to draw a lightsaber or use any Force powers. Of course, Palpatine has already told the Senate about the creation of the clone army. The information from Obi-Wan has already been received, and by helping Dooku abduct Anakin and Padme, Palpatine further increases the stakes for the war to come, and the incentive of the Jedi to rescue Obi-Wan and now Anakin as well. So it plays into Dooku's own ambitions, but it makes complete sense regarding Palpatine's own motivations, read this. Palpatine has, moreover, every investment in Amidala possibly being killed or imprisoned by the Separatists. It is his biggest political opponent and would then become the great martyr to his cause. And even were Padme to be rescued, as what ultimately transpires, Padme's own arguments against the army would be nullified. And this is an important aspect, I think. In my perfecting the Phantom Menace, Palpatine had far more screen time and presence here. He doesn't actually have as much screen time envisaged in this Clone Wars redraft. However, he has enough appearances, enough additional scenes in terms of really being able to show that he is an active as well as a passive director in all of these events, as opposed to simply everything turning out exactly as Palpatine would wish it, even though, given how convoluted the events are of the original films, so many other things could have happened. No, here Palpatine is far more hands-on. He is not simply relaying himself through messages, but is taking far more active steps to deceive other actors and indeed resort to brute force if necessary when it comes to Palpatine's direct raid on the Naboo Palace. With Palpatine having provoked the Clone Wars effectively, his grand army detachments aid in the rescue of the Jedi and Amidala. Freed, Obi-Wan and Anakin attempt to apprehend Dooku. Now, emphasize that when their fight takes place, it is completely different to how we see in the Clone Wars, not necessarily in the choreography. That's the least important aspect of this, because this is Dooku's first ever fight between other Jedi. Indeed, it should be intimated that Dooku has not, throughout the entire course of this film, fallen to the dark side. It is only during the course of this battle that Dooku finally capitulates to the dark side, when he makes a conscious decision to reject an offer to switch sides and join back with the Republic, which of course is something entirely consistent with Obi-Wan's character, and indeed Anakin's character at that point. But no, Dooku has decided finally that he is going to peg his future prospects and his political vision on the cause of the Separatists, and in so doing, he is forced to defeat the Jedi, lest he escape and continue to fight on and lead the war effort. It plays out exactly the same. Anakin is maimed, Obi-Wan is knocked out, but there is no need for Yoda to come in and save them here, because Dooku is still reverential enough towards the Jedi, and he still has those personal feelings of attachment to Qui-Gon and now transferred to Obi-Wan, where he has absolutely no incentive to kill them. He has incapacitated them, and he can just escape. There is no reason for him to needlessly kill them, albeit here he has essentially committed himself to the cause of the dark side, and indeed becoming fully immersed in the training of the shadowy aspect of Palpatine. How this leads Dooku is that Dooku is forced into an uneasy diarchy, rule of two, with Maul, but not the rule of two in the classical Sith sense, with Maul, which will persist throughout the duration of the Clone Wars and the beginning of the redrafted Revenge of the Sith. So as you can see, my additions here have very much been focusing on Palpatine's specific intrigues, but also in terms of really fleshing out Dooku, his motivations, his backstory, and indeed making the Clone Wars very much the tragedy of Count Dooku, because his character was already established very dramatically in the events of the council scenes in The Phantom Menace. In this redraft, we see him basically tearing up over the prospect that he's been overruled by the council. And that scene, really, you can say, is the progenitor of all the effects of Dooku's character development here. And he's a very sad and pitiable character in the way. And I think this really feeds into his characterization in the redraft we're going to see in Revenge of the Sith. But that is all I have to say. I will no doubt be coming back to do the final version of these redrafts of the redrafts. Thank you, everyone, for listening.